was two things. I knew, of course, that once we get to the scene of crime, the evidence in the Sovereign Forest, which some of you may have seen, that if you take the scene of crime to the scene of crime, then what happens? And I expect this is what would happen, which is that if you take the scene of crime to the scene of crime, and if you do a good job, then the people who are in the scene of crime are going to say, I mean, simply, thank you, it's a good job done, you're a really sensitive guy, you've done it well, you've kind of read it well, you've also, presented evidence, which, helps us to relook at the whole thing in our own location as well. But you really don't know what it means to be in the scene of crime. Still, it's because we are in the scene of crime, we know what it means to be here. And so actually, what gets pointed out to you immediately is its inadequacy. And the thing about its inadequacy is that the moment its inadequacy is pointed out, because we have been here, because we have been working in over several years, the inadequacy of that work actually leads you, not to doubt and withdrawal, but actually, how do you fix the inadequacy? And so you have to get in more evidence. You have to fill it up. The moment you fill it up, the moment you kind of fill the lacunae or the inadequacy, you have another problem, which is that you have more evidence of what is happening around. And the moment you have more evidence, you need a place. And so you get caught up again in the whole dynamics and the politics and the difficulties of a fixed location, of an institution. What would this form of institution be? Where will it exist? Second, if you take the scene of crime away from the scene of crime, which is, again, what one did. Of course, you do not know what will happen. You can only suppose. But if you take the scene of crime to, or the Sovereign Forest with the scene of crime and its evidence, to Kochi. And I have shown in Kochi for several years, all my films, many, many years, in different ways, in different contexts. This was another incredibly unique opportunity to show it in this form. What happened was, many things happened. Many people came. It was quite an incredible experience. But at least for me, what happened was that the scene of crime that I brought connected to the scene of crime of Kerala immediately. The people who came, they didn't just come to see, they came for a good day and to see things and so on and so forth. But specifically as far as the Sovereign Forest is concerned, for me, my understanding was it was the rice. It was the texts. It was the disappearance of the many incredible history and varieties and traditions of rice in Kerala that actually struck a chord. It was the disappearance of agriculture. It was the collapse of a certain existence of life and everything that went around it, which is something that is so much, in the heart of everybody in Kerala. If I took the Sovereign Forest to Documenta, we're talking about more than 1 million people within 3 months from across the world. And it's absurd to compare, venues, locations, Sharjahs, and so on. There are so many. Taking lightning testimonies to Documenta 12, apart, which was about sexual violence, many, many things happened. And I come back with maybe a very small kind of feeling and a very small memory, which may not be adequate, to do the kind of analysis that you are wanting to do this morning. But for me, there's a connection. Kassel was a military town. When the Red Army won, they came into Kassel. And it took me a little while to understand why there were so many old women coming to see the lightning testimonies repeatedly. Why there were so many old women who were giving me messages of, signs in one way or the other when I would go back to Kassel. So, you know, contexts are different, situations are different. I mean, yes, I know that I connected to Peru and I connected to Korea and I connected to Japan and I connected across the world with the lightning testimonies because, you know, the kind of massacre that, you know, the kind of violence that women face is global, no doubt. And it's not just a question of resonating with trauma. I mean, you know, different kinds of work, audiences relate to it differently and add to it differently. But coming back to the sovereign forest, taking sovereign forests to Documenta and to that scale of engagement meant that actually we are talking about, suddenly we are relating to the scene of crime elsewhere. We're talking about a kind of a global scene. Everybody is relating to it with their own territory. Everybody is relating to it with their own constellation. And in that sense, you can relate to, you can go anywhere. I mean, you can go to sovereignty, and, you know, Bangladesh and Pakistan both have, you know, the sovereignty lies in Allah. You can go there, you can go to Cairo, you can go to news, you can go to Tahrir, you can go to the news and the generation of news that is central to the entire experience there. So my time is over, but essentially, you know, what the sovereign forest does, again, afterwards, then you have to come back. You have to come back to the scene of crime. And you have to say, is Bhubaneswar enough? You know, 4.5 hours, 5 hours away from Bhubaneswar is a set of 3 villages that has been cordoned off for 6 years. About maybe 60% of people in that village haven't really dared to come out for 6 years, or they come out in hiding. Can the sovereign forest go there? Is there a method? Can it survive in that, you know, very fragile zone? On the other hand, you know, can it go to Seoul, which is, you know, the home of POSCO? And I think it is going this year, towards the end of the year, to Seoul. So in a peculiar kind of way, you know, both these territories can interconnect. And so, thank you.
Thank you very much, Amar, for giving us the genesis of the scene of crime in Orissa and where it went from there. But of course, conspicuous by its absence was how you related to it in Sharjah itself. But we do hope that will come up in our conversation.
Just a few weeks old.
Okay. Okay. Our next speaker for this afternoon is Ravi Agarwal. And Ravi is an artist, curator, writer, and environmentalist activist. He explores issues of urban space, ecology, capital in an interrelated way. And he works with photographs, video installations, and public art. He also describes his work as an investigation into a personal ecology. He's shown at Documenta 11, and of course at the Sharjah Biennial this year, amongst many, many other international and local shows. You know, Ravi, would you like to come? I had an opportunity to visit the Sharjah Biennial in 2007, which had as its thematic art and ecology. And while your work addresses ecological issues, you also speak of personal ecologies. So do you think you could elaborate on your understanding of the term ecology in the widest sense, and how it might relate to ecology of the biennial?
Firstly, I'd really like to thank Geeta for inviting me, and JNU and Pooja for introducing me. I'm going to respond to Geeta's suggestions of what I should speak upon. My concerns over the last few years have been to deal with issues of ideas of ecology, how ideas of ecology are constructed, ideas of nature are constructed, how they play out in rereadings of histories, almost like a gender question. Histories of where we are today have started to being read ecologically. Their impact of colonization in societies, and how different kinds of spaces have been constructed through the idea of ecology. I remember many years back I was talking to a Japanese economist, agroeconomist, and he said the reason Japanese cooperate so well with each other because there's so little space to grow rice in. If you don't cooperate with each other, then you will not be able to survive. So how ecological constraints really shape how we are culturally as well. When first Yoko proposed the idea of the courtyard, editorial note, and then I started reading the note, and there's obviously no obvious mention about ecology, though I think a lot of the note could be read ecologically when she talks about the interface with other cultures, starting with Ibn Battuta, then she starts talking about the co-construction of ideas of culture, and she proposes the courtyard as a private and a public space, where in the public space there is the interaction, the private space is what is held, and through which you bring that conversation to the private space. It immediately reminded me of my mother's Haveli in Rajasthan, where this was very physically constructed. And there was a large private family courtyard inside, and there's a large public courtyard where my grandfather met all his business folks, and the women didn't really come outside and meet anybody. So this question of this interface, when you bring new ideas in a place like Sharjah, and ecological ideas in a place like Sharjah, that of course you bring them into the Biennale, but how do they really interface? That's what's very unclear to me, that do they come back to the private courtyard? Is there a real negotiation? That interface was really unclear to me. So there is this whole bringing of great ideas of human rights, on which all our new societies, the modern societies, are constructed upon, on new ecological ideas, new ideas of freedom. But what do they mean to the traditional society, and what were they bringing on to the conversation? Because you saw in Sharjah almost no poster of the Biennale. When you walked around the actual sites of display, and you talked to the various shops who were selling, salwar kameezes or slippers or whatever, and you talked to the laborers they had no clue, and they said, can we go there? Is it really open? Is it free? Are we allowed inside? So there's a big disconnect, and there's actually no mechanism or no effort to reach out to them. And to me, this was really interesting, because if you look at the ecological question as well, which I did because on the last day I took a boat across the channel to see the work of a Japanese artist who was selling at the other end of the channel, across from the Biennale site, ice cream with salt and pepper. And that took me on a little trip down that port, which earlier had been on the side of the Biennale, where the Biennale site was, but has been shifted across. And you then encounter this whole port of where Indian dhows come in, getting in coal from Somalia, commodities from India, refrigerators, fresh fruit drinks, all kinds of commodities. And it is really a landscape which is so different that it almost contrasts with what you see on the other side. And it raises very, very many ecological questions, which I don't have answers for because I've never really lived there. I've never explored the area as an ecological space. But the questions which came to my mind that, firstly, what caused this shift? Why did you shift the sport from one end to the other? There was hardly any governmental control there. You could talk to the laborers very freely. There were no customs official to be seen, unlike any other port you could see. So one wondered what was the kind of institutions which were running that space. What kind of intrinsic control was there in this space that nobody dared to break the law? There were no borders, there were no fences, dhows were just coming in and goods were being offloaded, craned, and there was at one corner, there was a customs hall which everybody went to and paid whatever customs duty was meant to be paid. So it was a very odd kind of situation, no security, very open space where commodities are coming in, the large SUVs, and one wondered who was buying those SUVs. And if you then start reading about the history of the space, you find that in West Asia, especially after the post-oil boom, there has been a several-fold increase in population. It's gone from almost 40 million to 400 million people. That area has one of the largest footprints per capita in the world. It has probably the largest footprint. So the footprint is 11 kilometers. I'll talk about that image. It's 11 kilometer per capita. And if you consider that the per capita income difference is so wide that people are earning from 70,000 US dollars per year to 10,000 or 8,000 US dollars per year. You can immediately see that there's how this footprint, what is the nature of that footprint which is being caused. And from an area which is a very fragile ecosystem, which has 3 biodiversity hotspots, has several very species you don't find anywhere else in the world, it has now become an area of an environmental catastrophe, environmental degradation and catastrophe. There's a severe water crisis which is dealt with using desalination plants which have the highest carbon footprint in the world. They also have lead to great salination of the soil and nitrification of the soil, because 30% of the population traditionally lived on agriculture. And the trend is to go to nuclear energy without talking about what's going to happen to the waste. So when you see this kind of image in Dubai, which I went for a day in Dubai, and this is like a very obvious scene, these things. What is the counter side of that? What's happening to the ecological side of that? And what is the political economy through which people are participating in this whole growth? This was the kind of questions which come to mind. There is excessive amount of freshwater production, $4 billion bottles a day of freshwater production, and just a 4-day stock of freshwater. So if the salination plants break down, there's a 4-day stock of freshwater you have. So it's really fragile zone. You see this huge construction and huge, almost a chimera-like city, which has, or cities which have come up. And when you locate your work, which deals with the politics of ecology, or what's happening in the ecological space, in that space, one wonders what is that interaction of that work with what is happening, because scales are so different. And what are the institutions through which that kind of ideas, those works present, will be negotiated into something else. And it is not clear whether those institutions even exist there, because these are institutions of democracy, the institutions of participation, of community rights, institutions of transparency, of resource sharing and resource distribution. So placing that work, because Yoko invited me, she had seen one of my videos which she liked and she wanted to show that. I'll talk about the video a bit. But I also produced a diptych which talked about 2 landscapes. But having gone there, you felt really sort of so ineffectual, and so whether the ideas you're producing there have any significant meaning. This is an image from the Dao site, and these are just some images that I show you. Most of the laborers, as CAMP has done a lot of work with them, are from Gujarat. As I said, a lot of the curatorial note one can imagine that the curator has the ecological question in mind. She states it in not very obvious ways. Maybe it's too political, stated in very obvious ways, but it can be read into note. For example, she says, my concept for the Biennale seeks to emphasize and reinforce the important role that perspective and subjectivity play in the way socio-cultural spaces, geographical landscapes, and physical locales are perceived, interpreted, and engaged with. That could as well be read as an ecological question. The 2 works which I showed, one was called the Sewage Ponds Memoir, which talks about the issue of, it has 2 parallel narratives in a single channel video. One is of the memory of growing up in a desert landscape with almost no water. And it has the other visual narrative of a lush forest in Delhi, which has a huge sewage pond flowing through it, a sewage line flowing through it, open sewage line, which really does not look like sewage, it looks like fresh water. And both the memories are very contrasting to each other, and talk about how, about urban spaces and the construction of ideas of nature in urban spaces and in spaces where you traditionally grow up, where there is very little water. The second landscape, which I'll show you an image, it's a diptych of 2 images of marine landscape and an urban sewage landscape with two small figures of a fisherman and a waste picker. It's called Below the Surface. So a lot of my work is informed by now new ideas. This idea of nature has been constructed as a very fixed idea, and the questions which come up, especially with the climate crisis, are that is this predicted in the way we've dealt with the ideas of progress? It is predicted that you will come to a point where you can't go on with that. In the 70s, there was a well-known report called from the Club of Rome talking about the idea of limits, which was trashed then. But the idea of limits crops up again in the climate crisis because you are confronted with that if you carry on doing something, the planet will not last this century. The temperatures will go up so high that the whole ecological niche will be imbalanced. And of course, as we know, we are temperature-related ecological beings. Our whole bodies are ecological beings, very temperature-regulated. And if that happens, then, so if you start thinking about nature as something else, how do you rethink nature? What are the complex areas in which the idea of nature reappears or has appeared but been forgotten? Philosophers like Latour and Morrison talk about both about co-construction of ideas of nature, social through society and through interface with science, but also, in fact, hint at the idea that we may not need the category of nature. By creating the category of nature, you're creating a false other. And you need to look at different kinds of relationships which exist and which might lead you to different ideas of sustainability, different ideas of coexistence, which are critical to the way human societies might exist in the future. A lot of the things which are proposed as future ideas are essentially on the same trajectories of proposing new trajectories, new technologies, new ways of fixing things, but not fundamental shifts in the way we conceive of something. And like Amar talked, things like issues like marginalities, land management, and the place of nature in all this, and how space is demarcated and inhabited is very much part of the ecological question. So in that sense, you can read a lot which Yoke has proposed as an ecological question. And we are now well aware of the colonial roots of institutions and divisions of lands and forests, mapping and surveying. We know that the way land has been separated in colonial societies as forest and non-forest, it's been very much part of the history of institutions and the history of resource exploitation. The concerns today are about the financing and corporatization of nature through neoliberal capital. Jibesh hinted at the scale of capital, the commodification of life through patents and genetic engineering, the role of gender and resource independence in the creation of all these ideas. And the current trends to look at politics of ecology and politics of nature is to critically try and uncover through what you might call art, through creating new forms and new ideas which fall outside all current disciplines. And it's almost more than cross-disciplinary. It's almost like creating a new politics of new imaginations, a new space which can only be reimagined as a new space and not as an extension of a breaking of boundaries. And that's what some of the new art and ecology work tries to do, is to create a new space which itself creates a non-governmentality kind of politics, which we are so used to in activist worlds. So ultimately, the aim is to cut across social heterogeneities of caste, class, gender, and geography, because somewhere in that is the idea of the future ideas of equitable sharing of resources, equitable ways of surviving this planet exist. And so these are complex questions because they go across so many histories and ideas and so many current institutions. One of the key problems today is about the institutional locks, because many of the institutions, the land and water institutions, for example, which we are landed up in today, are from the 18th and 19th century Europe. And they, for example, the planning body looks after the land, and the water body looks after the water, but nobody talks about the wetland. There's no body with, no institutional body invested in the idea of the wetland, the interface. And that's the most critical ecological space. Because in the 19th century, we came to think of nature in a certain way, in a certain functional way. And if we don't revive, we don't unlock these institutions into rethinking, then we are not able to proceed in changing how the world functions. So some of the work, both as an activist and as trying to find artistic forms or forms which relate to the artistic form, have been to deal with these problems. And it is not enough to be dealing with them with a particular discipline, a particular known form of engagement, like being an activist, but through new imaginaries. And that is the kind of thing which really I'm engaged with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ravi. Great food for thought, and I'm sure we'll come back to it in the question-answer session. We now have CAMP. And CAMP, which was established in 2007, is a collaborative studio organized by Shaina Anand and Ashok Sukumaran that focuses on independent artistic and media work. CAMP manifests through both short and long-term projects relating to media and its history, its formats, and distributions. The process enacted by CAMP often follow the spirit of open source communities and work closely with old and new technical systems. Ashok and Shaina